Welcome to the second of two screencasts looking at exam skills for the mass media section of the SY2 A Sociology exam. So in the previous screencast we focused on the 20-mark question, which is the first of two questions that you have to answer on the mass media section of the SY2 exam. Now in this screencast we're going to focus on this longer 40-mark essay question where the command word will either be assess or discuss, and these command words are really signposting the fact that the key skill that you need to demonstrate on this section of the exam is the skill of evaluation. Now there are three main types of longer essay questions that they might ask you for the 40-mark question on media, and each of these questions requires a slightly different structure. So you get questions that ask you to evaluate a claim, you get questions that ask you to evaluate a particular theoretical perspective, and then you get questions that ask you to evaluate sociological explanations, which means a range of theoretical explanations. So before you go any further with this particular screencast, it's essential that you've watched both of the videos that I've made on essay writing, so essay writing part 1, essay writing part 2, because these screencasts go through each of these essay structures. And even though a lot of the examples that I use in these two screencasts are taken from A2 topics, the generic advice about essay writing in both of these videos is really essential for the longer essay questions that you have to do at AS level as well. So the first type of longer essay question would be one that asks you to evaluate a claim. And if you've watched the screencasts on essay writing, part 1, you'll be familiar with this 4-part essay structure that you need to use for this type of longer essay question. And here we've got 3 examples of past exam questions from the media section that fit this particular format. And if we look at the command words, we see that very often you're going to be asked with this type of question to discuss a particular viewpoint or to assess a particular view. And the most important thing to remember with this type of question is to make sure that you look at both the arguments in favour of the claim as well as the arguments that are against the claim. Weaker candidates often write very one-sided answers where they just look at arguments that support the claim rather than challenging it and criticising it as well. The third question that we can see on this slide starts with a slightly different instruction, so you've been asked here to discuss the extent, but it's essentially the same type of question as the first one. If you're asked to discuss the extent to which the media promotes gender stereotypes, then you've got to look at the arguments both in favour of that particular viewpoint and the arguments against. So it's really the same type of question as this one. The second type of longer essay question that could appear as the 40-marker in the media section would be a question that asks you to evaluate a particular theory. And for this type of question you need to adopt the 5-part essay structure, which is described in the second of the 2 general screencasts that I've made on how to write sociology essays. And here we see 3 examples of questions that fit this particular format from the media section. And finally, you could get a 40-mark question that asks you to evaluate sociological explanations. And for this type of question you need to adopt this type of structure, which is again described in the second of the 2 screencasts that I've made on essay writing. What we can see on this slide is the top of the mark band for this particular question. So there are 20 marks for knowledge, then there are 20 marks for analysis and evaluation. So these are really important skills that you need to demonstrate on this longer question. And remember, it's a minute a mark, so you need to spend 40 minutes on this section of the exam. So this question alone is worth just under half of the total marks available for the SY2 paper. Now this table is an attempt to make the mark scheme that was on the previous slide a bit clearer. a bit more student friendly. So these are the criteria that examiners will be looking for in longer sociology essay questions, and in order to get an A or a B, you need to provide good evidence of virtually all of these things. In order to get a really high mark for this 40-mark question, you have to display the skill of evaluation, and that includes looking at the arguments and evidence for and against a particular viewpoint. It includes examining a theory's assumptions or linking it to a particular perspective. It includes putting forward alternative views and perspectives. And finally, it includes a discussion of the strengths or advantages or limitations and disadvantages of a theory, perspective or research method. And when you're critically evaluating sociological explanations, try challenging a sociological explanation by asking the following key questions. So firstly, ask yourself whether or not the theory leaves out important information. So think about what the theory ignores. In other words, what are the blind spots of this particular theoretical perspective or explanation that you're examining? Secondly, ask yourself what assumptions the theory makes, and can any of those underlying assumptions be challenged? So, for example, an assumption that Marxists make about media audiences is that they are relatively passive, and that might be challenged by other sociologists who would argue that audiences are capable of interacting critically with media texts. And thirdly, you can also generate criticisms of the theory by asking yourself whether or not the theory overemphasizes certain features of the media. For example, we could argue that maybe pluralism as a perspective overemphasizes things like choice and diversity and audience control of the media at the expense of important issues such as media concentration. And these three questions, I think, can help you evaluate sociological explanations, not just with the media topic, but with any AS or A2 sociology topic. What we can see on this grid are some useful words and phrases that you can use within your essays to explicitly signpost your evaluative points to the examiner. So using words and phrases such as the ones that we can see on this grid show the examiner where you're displaying this important skill. And you should notice that evaluation isn't just about being negative and critical. Evaluation can also involve explicitly signposting what you consider to be the key advantages or strengths of particular theories, arguments and evidence. I'm going to end this screencast by looking at two student answers to the same 40-mark question. And the 40-mark question that we're looking at is this one: discuss the extent to which the media promotes gender stereotypes. So I'd like you to hit the pause button and read the opening two paragraphs of the first student answer to this essay question. Now, this introductory paragraph is actually quite poor, and the reason for that is it really lacks focus on the question set. So the term gender stereotypes is not clearly explained or defined, and it's not discussed in the context of the media, which should be the focus of this question. The second paragraph is better. Here the candidate makes some useful points in relation to this particular study, which is used to discuss the contribution to the debate on media stereotypes. Here are the next two paragraphs of this student answer, so once again hit the pause button and read through both of them. So in this third paragraph, the candidate brings in Marxist ideas, but the connection to the media is obscure, as the point that this candidate tries to make is much more relevant to the family and work. However, the second half of this paragraph is much more relevant to the question set. The fourth paragraph, we've got good application of the liberal feminist approach, and this is supported with a relevant example. Okay, here are the next two paragraphs, so once again hit the pause button and read through them. The fifth paragraph has some good content about gender stereotypes, particularly in relation to men and this concept of hegemonic masculinity, so that's good use of terminology. And the sixth paragraph is probably the most evaluative part of this particular essay, because the candidate compares and contrasts a couple of studies and makes several good points about gender differentiation on the one hand and gender convergence on the other. And finally, with this answer, hit the pause button and read through this concluding paragraph. And once again we see a problem with this concluding paragraph in that the candidate needs to have much more of a focus back to the question set. So this discussion of Sarah Fortin's research doesn't really explicitly link to the topic of the media. And the overall mark for this particular answer was 25 marks out of the 40 marks available, which would probably be around about a grade C. So let's compare this with our second answer to the same question. So once again, hit the pause button and read through these first two paragraphs. So you should be able to see from this opening paragraph that there's a much more explicit focus on the question set. So the answer begins confidently, compares three types of feminism and their views explicitly on the media's role in stereotyping women. And with this second paragraph, although it's mainly about women, there's also recognition of the media also acting as a controlling force on men as well as women. I also want to draw your attention to this very last sentence of the second paragraph, because this is a good example of what I would call a linking sentence that clearly connects the knowledge displayed in the paragraph back to the question set. Okay, here are the next two paragraphs, so hit the pause button and read through both of these. So within the third paragraph, we've got reference to the work of Naomi Wolf, and this is used effectively in terms of the topic of media stereotypes. And within the next paragraph, we've got effective use of another key sociological study. Okay, hit the pause button and read through the next two paragraphs. And paragraph number 5 contains some good evaluation because it's looking at the extent to which there's been a change to some of the traditional stereotypes that have been discussed earlier in the essay. And within the 5th paragraph, we've got very effective discussion of the postmodernist perspective, which is useful because it acts as an alternative view to the feminist perspectives that were discussed earlier in the essay. And finally, just take a read through this concluding paragraph. And this, I think, is a really good example of a conclusion because it ends the answer with a short and crisp final paragraph that's really focused on the question set. So this second answer, I hope you can see, is much better than the first answer, and it got 34 marks out of 40 in the exam, which would probably be equivalent to a low grade A. Remember that you can find all the past exam questions and lots of other revision materials within iLearn.